Hey everyone, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. I'm glad to have you back for the show, which you can get on Apple, Google, Spotify, Liftable, Edify. 14 channels. I only remembered 5 of them off the top of my head. But go to wherever you get the podcast, please, and give it a review so that more people can see it. Why? Because this is the show where I interview major thought leaders to show that worldview changes everything. Well, today's guest is a person who formerly a male who formerly identified as a woman. In fact, for 8 years, went through this process and went through the whole hormone process. Everything that we talk about related to the issue of transgender, even that term, we're going to be talking about in this session. Now, this individual has a passion to help those who regret gender, attempts to change their gender, who are struggling with their gender. His story reminds us that gender ideology isn't just a philosophical issue, it's personal. And you know what? As difficult as this interview is, it's going to give us hope that we can find healing. Welcome to the show. Walt Heyer, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Jeff, for having me on. It's exciting.
I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. I've read your story, and my wife Stephanie and I have talked quite a bit about it, and it is really an honor to have you here.
Thank you.
And we're going to be talking about issues related to gender and sexuality, gender ideology, and your story gives us unique insight into this. And I wonder if you would just tell us a little bit about what you went through as a child, attempting to transition to be a woman, and then grasping a biblical perspective of sexuality and gender, and then we'll talk about how this affects what we're facing culturally today.
Well, I will say it takes a long time to kind of get your head around this, and especially if you're a youngster like I was when I started this whole process at the age of 4 in 1944. So what happened? And what happened to me was my mom, in 1941, already had one son. She was 20 years old. I came along. She did not want me. My mom did not like me. She did not want me. She admitted that she almost killed me when I was 2.5 years old. So I was an unwanted child. And I think and then having her mother babysit me, and I started cross-dressing in Grandma's clothes, was probably my way of trying to find a way to be accepted. And so these things, when you have these things go on, it's really not, and I think it's critical. I learned this much later in life, is that it really wasn't about my gender or my sexuality. It was about, is somebody going to love me? Because my mom didn't love me. How am I going to be loved? What do I have to do as a young boy to be loved? So do I have to identify as a female, put on women's clothes because Grandma said I look very cute, and all that was wonderful. So, and then when my dad found out, then my dad started doing some pretty heavy physical discipline with a hardwood floor plank. So that was as a boy. So if you think about this, I was affirmed and excited by Grandma telling me how cute I looked as a girl, and when Dad found out that I was cross-dressing, he's hitting me with a hardwood floor plank. So as a boy, I'm getting hit, or I'm getting either Mom or Dad are harming me. Grandma's not, because I'm wearing a purple dress.
Yeah.
So then because of the purple dress, then my dad's adopted teenage brother he thought that I was fair game to be sexually molested. So now, this all before I'm 9 years old, and this is in the 40s, and so I have a mom who does not like me, did not want to have me. I'm cross-dressing because I'm trying to find somebody who's going to love on me, besides my grandmother, and my dad's hitting me with a hardwood floor plank, and my uncle's sexually molesting me. So when you have those things and you're not 10 years old, what do you do with this package you have? So you try to find some avenue that you can fit into where you're not being sexually abused, emotionally abused. And what I have learned is that it really wasn't about gender. I mean, the whole thing is that I wanted to remove my genitalia because that was the only way that I could prevent someone from sexually molesting me.
Wow.
So you remove your genitalia. It's not about becoming a female. It's about being able to prevent someone from touching you there. If they're gone, they won't touch me. That's the mentality. So that's not gender dysphoria. That's not gender disorder. That's actually a crime of being sexually abused. And so you have these abuses go on, and a 9 or 10 or 12-year-old, 15-year-old boy does not know how to deal with this. So I spent the rest of my life really trying to find a way to find acceptance, find love, and it was a struggle. And by the time I was 13, I had a secret name, Crystal West, that I used. That was sort of my hiding place when I was feeling discomfort. I would sort of go into that in my head. I was still cross-dressing secretly. And so I had this radio playing sort of in my head that there was always something wrong with me. I mean, that's the ultimate point about this, is that when somebody starts cross-dressing you or affirming you or telling you or you thinking that you're different, what they're really saying is, and this is why I say it's not about gender, it's not about sexuality. What they're saying is that there's something wrong with you as a boy, and you're going to be okay if you're a girl. It's has nothing to do with sexuality or any of this other terminology they use. So the fact of the matter is there wasn't anything wrong with me as a boy. It's just that people took to these abuses that I suffered, and I had no way and no therapy to deal or anyone to help me through that as a child psychologist or someone to work through these things or to do counseling with the parents or, there's a lot to deal with there. And so I'm not equipped to deal with it. So I'm doing the best I can. By the time I'm in my teens, I'm using alcohol. I'm doing everything I can. I'm on, I'm a kid. I'm running track. I was lean and small. I was pretty good in track, trying to find acceptance. I had a group of people around me, buddies, and I ended up getting a 1934 Ford, thinking, okay, if I had this car, I'd have the coolest car at school. This is a way to find acceptance. And so, but I was still struggling with being sexually abused, physically abused, psychologically and emotionally abused as a child. Those things don't go away because you have a nice red 34 Ford with a Corvette engine in it. So I didn't understand that. And so as I went on, this was never about homosexuality. I never had same-sex attraction. I never was homosexual. I don't understand homosexuality. It was never an issue. I didn't know how to deal with the issues that had happened to me during my life. And so I had a girlfriend. Eventually, I got married and had 2 children. I worked in the aerospace industry. I became an associate design engineer on the Apollo space missions. I left that, went into the auto industry, and was one of the 3 people that helped develop the Acura division for American Honda Motor Company. So I had these things going on, but I was using cocaine. I was using alcohol. Why? Because I had not dealt with the emotional, psychological, and physical abuse that I'd endured as a child because I didn't know how. And the only equipment that I had was using alcohol and drugs. Even though I'd found a niche in work, I could not resolve those issues that had happened to me as a child. So when I went to the gender therapist that I went to, his name was Dr. Paul Walker, actually wrote the standards of care that are in place today. They're called WPATH. He wrote them in 1978 in San Diego, California, with a group of other doctors. And so he was the fame guy on gender, quote, dysphoria, gender identity disorder back in the late 70s, and he wrote the standards. My therapist told me that what you need is hormone therapy and surgery. That was his wisdom about what I'd gone through. Even though I'd told him about being sexually and emotionally, psychologically abused, that did not matter.
This was a therapist saying this, not a medical doctor, but a...
This was a therapist.
Okay.
He was the guy who wrote the standards of care that directed
Right.
people how to assess and provide treatment for people who struggled. Even though he knew about my abuses, that none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was hormones and surgery. And by the way, that's exactly what's happening today.
Yeah.
That happened to me in 1981. Nothing has changed,
Wow.
which is remarkable. That they still use, all the time people write me and say, I went in In one session, they're giving me hormones. They told me I'm transgender. I have gender dysphoria. I'm on the way. So this is the machine that they use. They don't do therapy. You know, when people say, well, did they do any therapy? They don't even know how to do therapy. The only thing they know how to do is introduce you to hormones and how to push you toward cutting off perfectly good body parts you don't need to cut off. So without any Walt Heyer out there at the time that was making national headlines about this and pushing the idea, the bridge is out, don't do this, it's harmful, I had no place to turn. So I had to believe, because there was no opposition, that what he, as a doctor, said was true. And so after living the life identifying as Laura Jensen for 8 years, I realized that after studying psychology at UC Santa Cruz, because I was going to become a psychologist and actually help people, what I realized was that they all have some comorbidity, some issue, something happened. And so the real task isn't giving them hormones and surgery, it's finding out what happened. Yeah. And so today I always say, just tell me what happened that caused you to not like who you are. That's what I want to know. To me, that's the main question. Because it doesn't have to do with gender, it doesn't have to do with sex. It has to do with why you don't like who you are. And so if we can identify what that is, then we can provide effective, sound, long-term treatment for why you don't like who you are. Yeah. What happened?
Yeah.
And so I'm not a doctor. I'm not a therapist. It's just I get the information I've gotten comes from my life and from the thousands of people I've worked with. And every time that I have the opportunity to work with somebody, believe it or not, what happens is when they're prepared to dig into this, they find resolution in the issues without ever needing hormones and surgery, because it doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, this is, there's so many important things to what you've just said there. And I appreciate, you're not a therapist. I'm not a therapist. We're not trying to offer counseling here.
No.
We're just talking about real life. And your point, I think, is extremely significant and hardly ever mentioned as people talk about gender ideology, use the term comorbidities. Talk about that a little bit more, because in your case, it was childhood trauma. That seems obvious. And if the therapist would say, ignore that and send you on for hormone therapy, it sounds like another level of abuse that was being heaped on you.
Yeah, and the term for it is called adverse childhood experiences, called ACEs. There's actually a test for testing trauma on ACEs, and many trauma therapists and that's who I send the people I work with to. I send them to trauma therapists to be evaluated for where they fit on the scale. Many of them hit this, 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 because of things that happen, but no one ever sends them to a trauma therapist. I say, run away from a gender therapist all day long. Run to a trauma therapist or somebody who's going to dive into what comorbidity you have. I've got someone right now that I'm working with who had schizophrenia, bipolar 1 disorder, PTSD, and they did surgery on him and cut off his genitals and here's the thing. They knew when they had him in their care for 10 years, and they were the ones that diagnosed him with these disorders. It wasn't like it was foreign to them, and yet they said, oh, you have gender dysphoria. He only lasted 5 months after surgery when he contacted me and said, I want my life back. I'm not homosexual. I don't know why they did this to me. Well, schizophrenia, yeah. Why would you ever do anything such as therapy with hormones and surgery to somebody who has schizophrenia? That's insane. Yeah. And so what I have found 100% of the time, if I spend enough time with them, they allow me to dive into their life. Not all of them do, but the ones that do, we can identify what caused them to have this discomfort. As an example, recently a young man, when he was 13 years old, he was struggling with his gender identity. He contacted me in an email about 2 months ago. He's 74. And here's how I approach this. People need to know this, because I'm not a little fuzzball. I'm an old man that doesn't like what's going on. Yeah. And so he writes me and says, my therapist says I have gender dysphoria. I'm a transgender, and I transitioned many years ago it was. So I wrote him back and said, well, your therapist is a quack. you're not a transgender and you never transition, but if you'll spend some time with me, we'll figure this out. And he wrote back and he said, well, that's pretty harsh. But he said, I want to see what you have to say. And so I said, well, tell me what happened when you were 13 years old, because you said that was kind of the onset. You picked a time and an age. Tell me what was going on in your life. Now, remember, this only happened in 2 or 3 emails. This is not complicated.
Yeah.
He writes me and says, my mom was a dreadful alcoholic, and she would get a butcher knife and chase my dad around the house trying to murder him almost every night when I was 13.
Wow.
And because I'm brilliant, right, I wrote him back and said, well, it sounds like trauma, right? So I said, you need a trauma therapist. Well, he got trauma therapy and 1 2-hour session. 1 2-hour session. And he had no longer a desire to be transgender.
What happens during in 2 hours? What happens during that kind of a session that...
The EMDR therapy is, and I met with, just 2 weeks ago with a counselor that I really respect, and I sat down with him at lunch and said, can that really happen? That it happened that quick? Because I said, that's astonishing to me, because most of the people don't have that kind of reaction. He said, it can happen. It doesn't happen very often, but it can with the right person who knows how to administer this therapy. It can happen, and it did. And I kept writing the guy back. I said, have you slipped back, Mm-hmm. And for 3 or 4 weeks, he kept writing me. He said, no, I'm free. I'm done with this. Mm-hmm. And so, therapy is not very complicated. If you can identify, a death in the family, the dad got murdered, the dad died in a brutal plane accident that was all over the television. I've had that. Terrible divorces, sexual abuse is high on the scale. But I think it's so important that this is never about gender sex. Mm-hmm. It's about something that happened. It's about some issue. And today what we do is we're guiding people toward the gender sex ideology as if it is the cure, and it's not. It's actually the opposite of what they need.
Let me ask you a question about these classrooms, because this is what we're seeing happen more often, is that little children will go to school and the teacher will say, we're going to talk about gender. Here's the gender unicorn. You may be a boy, but in a girl, you may be in the wrong body or what have you. So you can change your name, you can change your pronouns, things like that. Is that sort of a kind of a classroom way of targeting children who are already experiencing some kind of trauma? I mean, what kind of child would listen to that and say, I think my teacher's right. I think I am in the wrong body. What happens?
Well, I call this institutionalized child abuse, because kids are vulnerable. Kids are very curious, especially the young ones that they're targeting. And I think there's this, I know for a fact from talking to young people, some of them are fearful of not identifying as a transgender, that they'll be rejected. They're not suffering from gender dysphoria. We have what I call the social contagion of these ideologies being pressed on, and they look around, they go, oh, Johnny did this or Betty did that. And it's like, I'm going to be the odd guy out if I don't. And it's not that they have it. I've actually worked directly with the mother and the child, and they say, I don't have it, but I'm doing this anyway. Because it's an acceptance thing. Right now, it's so driven, and that's why it should not be in the classroom. It's child abuse to introduce this to children, because I believe that is what we call adverse childhood experience. You're telling the kid that you can become someone else. It's total false. I mean, nothing could be more flagrantly false than telling them they can become someone else. It's absolute lie. I could use a different word, but that is just, it's horrible to think that we have adults who choose to abuse children emotionally and psychologically with the gender unicorn and all of these other ideologies. This should not be in public schools. And I've written about it, and what it is, it's the onset of Marxism. Marxism is when we can destroy. See, because here's what I call transgenderism: how we dehumanize males and females. It's dehumanizing.
Yeah.
You're not who you are. So if you can dehumanize male and female, you can actually begin. You look at the process and look at the overarching issue. We're destroying the identity of male and female and putting them in some other category.
So you're saying Marxist, and not in terms of because I think some people are going to social,
social Marxism,
right? Yeah, because I think some people are going to go, I don't see that connection.
This is social Marxism, and it was kind of introduced by Black Lives Matter, who said they wanted to destroy the nuclear family. That was their objective. Okay. And so if you look at it through that prism, and look at what they're trying to do, I mean, I can't see. I've been through this, and I can't imagine anybody suggesting to anyone that they can become someone else when they can't do it. See, that just kind of just doesn't work for me. And then when I work with the people who I've worked with, and they say it's not about gender sex, it's about either a social contagion, or it's about an indoctrination, or it's about something that actually happened to me that was traumatizing. Now, there's some other things that are in there too, but and certainly autism is a huge issue. Autism, the kids are very vulnerable, and they can be easily slid into this. So they're picking the most vulnerable. So when you talk about in the classroom, the most vulnerable people, well, one of the girls I worked with, as an example, just came. Their family moved. He was a police officer. They moved their 4 children. One of them went to school. She was uncomfortable in that school, but they started introducing this stuff to her. Mm-hmm. And she actually admits today, after we took her out of this nonsense, that she did it because she just wanted to be accepted in school. She was afraid to not do this. So we have to be really careful. I don't believe anybody when they say they have gender dysphoria. They're just using a term.
Right. Yeah.
I don't accept it.
Yeah. So when they go to a gender clinic and they receive a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, somebody reaches out to you, either that person or maybe a parent, and says, "Hey, this is the diagnosis that we got." What do you help them do, or what do you recommend? What steps should they be taking?
Yeah, when I worked with the parent, I said, "Okay, tell me if you know of anything that happened to this child in early childhood," mm-hmm. because I don't believe they have gender dysphoria. I think they're just acting out this behavior because they haven't resolved whatever happened. 100% of the time, we can find an issue, a serious issue. And oftentimes it's even just a horrible divorce. Dad's gone, or mom's gone, and they got dad, whatever. And so we have to be much better at blowing off these ideologies and digging down to what the heart of the issue is. And the heart of the issue is something happened, and we need to find out what it is. And it's not easy to do sometimes. Yeah. And I've continually worked with individuals sometimes for 2 or 3 years. So it's not like the guy who just went to therapy, and that doesn't happen very often. So people are reluctant to share with you that their dad sexually abused them. Mm-hmm. They're reluctant to tell you that something happened. And the reason why they're reluctant, I think this is real instructive, is they're afraid if they tell you, then you're not going to say they have gender dysphoria and they can't get the hormones.
Oh, okay. Because they see the hormones as the magic pill, the silver bullet that will allow them to feel at ease with themselves after all of these years.
I'm joining this movement.
Yeah. Okay.
It's why I use social contagion. I mean, this is like everybody joining together. You see, it's madness. It's insane, actually, and yet we're perpetrating it on children. And so that's why I travel around the country speaking at Capitol buildings and saying, "Don't do this to children." Mm.
Well, you mentioned when we were talking, but just before the show, you used the term of how this is this is an attempt to control language. It is a manipulation of language.
Absolutely.
And when you mention Marxism, cultural Marxism, and I know, and I understand, some ministries, we talk about the Marxist worldview. We're not allergic to that discussion. We just dive right into it. But sometimes it's difficult for people to say, oh, well, this is Marxism, that's Marxism, whatever. But what you're talking about here is the breaking down of absolutes to make people controllable.
Exactly.
That's what, and if you can convince a child to look at a boy and look at a girl and say there is no difference, then you can really convince them of anything.
Absolutely.
They're like the perfect object of propaganda from that point forward.
That's exactly right. And this, we got gender queer, we have non-binary. You've probably heard the term non-binary. A friend of mine, James Shoup, was in Oregon and decided he wanted to see how stupid the courts would be. And he went to the court and petitioned that they would change his birth record to non-binary. And he said, I just want to find out if they do it. They did it.
Wow.
Not because he was non-binary. It's just that just shows you what they will do.
Yeah.
And so I think, and I think this is so critical that we use the right language and we say they're feminized men and masculinized women. They're not transgender, they're not transitioning, and they don't have gender dysphoria. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Critical.
Yeah. Talk about that. So what you're fighting against is this idea that there is a spectrum, masculine male over here, feminine female over here, and then everybody's going to fit somewhere in between. But what you're saying is there is a spectrum for male and there's a spectrum for female.
Yes.
Which is what the Bible actually teaches and is what biology shows us. How did we lose that basic understanding?
Because we bought into the word transgender.
Okay.
I mean, we sunk our own ship. And I believe every time we use the word transgender, we're just helping them out.
Okay.
And when I recently spoke, 200 or 300 people, and one of the things I said, ladies and gentlemen, what is wrong with a masculine woman and what is wrong with a feminine man? Someone tell me, because I don't get that. Mm-hmm. We don't need to change anybody. Let's celebrate the masculine woman and let's celebrate the feminine guy. Mm-hmm.
In other words, break down
yeah.
the if you remove the stereotypes and the labels, then what's left of their argument?
There isn't any.
Yeah.
They're men and they're women, and that's all there is. That was determined at conception, male sperm, woman egg, and these transgender identities, when they go through these procedures, they can't produce sperm and they'll never produce a child. Mm-hmm. So this is what I call the second abortion 2.0.
Wow.
Because this is just another way to control society. These kids will never produce a child. Mm-hmm. And a girl will never, they're doing hysterectomies on girls before they're 18 years old, 15, 16 years old. Not because they have gender dysphoria, not because they need a hysterectomy, but because something happened and no one wants to take the time to look into what it is and give them the proper treatment for it.
They're just assuming that by mutilating the body, somehow they can heal the mind.
Yeah, I wrote a book called Paper Genders about that, and there was a doctor, early in the 1900s that would actually take organs out. They had mental disorders, and so he was taking all kinds of organs out of their bodies. And so I've forgotten the name of the doctor, even though I wrote the book. Isn't that funny? But the book is great. And so they celebrated him in the Los Angeles Times as a very creative, fantastic doctor that was curing mental illness. He wasn't curing mental illness. 40% of the patients were dying from his surgeries. And then in that book, I talk about Walter Freeman doing the frontal lobotomy, taking an ice pick, sticking it through the eye into the brain, and literally lobotomizing people to where somebody has to feed them. And he called that a success because they were no longer suffering.
Wow.
You see, what we've And I put that on the same track with cutting off people's genitalia and filling them full of hormones. This is barbaric. Absolute barbaric. It's dehumanizing, and it's destroying children. And it's destroying an entire generation of children today.
I'm still, you, by the way, you have a lot of good company. We've had a lot of, this is the third or fourth episode of this podcast that we've done on this issue, and every one of them says this is the greatest medical scandal of the 21st century.
Absolutely.
But you brought another angle to it that I hadn't heard before, abortion 2.0, if you go through puberty blocking drugs and then transition into cross-sex hormones, you're almost certain to be sterile.
Absolutely.
Which means you'll never be able to have children.
Right.
Which means, that's humanity. That's
the end.
Yeah, that's
the end. Yeah, and this is I have the young 25-year-old that had schizophrenia and bipolar and PTSD said, I was never homosexual. I just wanted to get married and have a family. And he said, now I can't.
Oh, wow. Is there, well, I think you've helped us, especially those who are parents, if they have a child who says, I think I was born in the wrong body, which happens a lot. A lot of children will come home from school. This idea has been planted in their minds, or maybe they feel rejected at school, and this is maybe a path toward acceptance. We've talked about the parents. I want to talk about the therapists for a moment because, and this is going to ignite a controversy. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of states now that have banned any kind of therapy other than gender-affirming therapy. Mm-hmm. 22 states, in fact, have actually banned it. Yeah. So if a therapist says, let's work on the underlying issues rather than go through gender-affirming procedures, they could actually be legally at risk for doing that, couldn't they?
Well, there's a real easy solution. If you are skilled in trauma therapy and you can test them on a trauma scale and they suffer from trauma, you can apply trauma therapy.
Okay.
That there's no prohibition against identifying a trauma and treating it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate that understanding because I have had therapists tell me, look, if we can deal with the underlying issue, that literally 85 to 95% of the time, the gender identity issues go away.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, therapists are brilliant people for the most part. Some of them, I think, are a little too... if more therapists stepped up and diagnosed what they saw, if you've got somebody who has schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, you're not really going out on a limb saying this is not gender dysphoria. Mm-hmm. You can even say to the individual you're working with, say, you may have gender dysphoria, but you also have schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Let's treat those disorders first.
Yeah.
In the same way, we know, they always talk about the suicide ideation. Well, we know for a fact that 90% of people who commit suicide were suffering from untreated psychological disorders because nobody provided effective treatment for their disorders. And that's exactly why Sweden reported you're 19 times more likely to die by suicide after going through these procedures because nobody's treating their disorders.
Right.
So, again, I'm not a smart guy, but some of this stuff is pretty kindergarten stuff.
Yeah. So so Sweden, I think, is an example. I know in Finland and Great Britain, I've seen that they have moved away from recommending medicalization as a treatment of gender disorders
Watchful
towards
waiting.
psychotherapy. Yeah.
Yeah.
They call it watchful waiting.
Yeah, that was even in WPATH standards. You know, everybody just blew by them. You know, it's like the red light that they never stopped at. So watchful waiting has been recommended for years. It's just that people don't make much money off of it, especially the pharmaceutical companies, and they get scorned for, oh, why are you doing that? You know, my kid needs hormones or whatever. Hey, let me give you a perfect example. Here's a boy contacted me. He was 19 years old, wrote me a letter, and long letter, but basic headline was, when I was 15, I told my parents I was struggling, and they took me to a gender clinic. They said I had gender dysphoria. They put me on hormone blockers when I was 18. My parents took me to the clinic. They did top and bottom surgery. And when he's 19, he contacts me. He says, I feel like a Frankenstein monster. Can you help me get my life back? And I wrote him, and I said, and I published this article in the Daily Signal. I said, Nathaniel, why did you do this? What caused you to go through this process? He said, I got addicted to pornography.
Okay.
And I didn't understand who I was. And so a good therapist would have sat down before he ever got hormone blockers into this young person and dove into, what are you doing during the day? Are you on? I do this all the time. I ask parents, look at the search history on your child's computer, and you will learn a great deal about why they're acting the way they're acting. Don't be afraid to do that. And don't let them have a computer in the room. Bring it out in the living room so everybody can see what they're doing. And so, you know, there's things that we can do as adults, which we should be doing. You know, PETA does a better job at protecting animals than we do at protecting children.
Wow. Yep. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
They jump into it. They have all kinds of systems in place. They advocate for protection. We don't. Yeah. For some reason, kids have become this thing that we can mess with. You know, they become, you know, there's so many people who use kids, misuse them sexually, emotionally, psychologically, surgically, and hormonally. This has to stop, or we're going to destroy families. The foundation of the church is built on mom, dad, and children. And if we don't stop this, there isn't going to be any foundation left, because there's not going to be any moms and dads. They're going to be all transgenders.
Yeah. Well, you know, we condemn ancient civilizations that had child sacrifice, but that's really what we're doing.
Spot on. Yeah, they're just disposable children.
Wow. Well, we need every child to know that they're made in the image of God, and that they're not born in the wrong body.
That's right.
And that they have great value and worth, and they're deserving of protection.
Yeah, absolutely. My heart breaks. I mean, I was a 4-year-old who went through this and struggled. You know, here I'm 78 years later, I'm still talking about it.
Yeah.
So for people to say it doesn't do any harm, and why am I talking about it for 78 years later? Because it's harmful.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
You don't even socially transition a kid. You don't tell a kid he can become someone. You don't dress a boy as a girl. You don't do these things. It's emotional and psychological child abuse that oftentimes turns into something much worse.
Yeah.
We got to stop it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate all of the issues that you've brought up, and I think of the guests we've had who've talked about transgender, no one has yet, until you, mentioned the connection between pornography use and gender confusion. And so, man, that's going to be one we have to explore more. That's really significant. That would explain the massive numbers of young people who are all of a sudden confused about their gender. I mean, it was literally all of a sudden, right? Like almost within 3 or 4 years, it tripled and then tripled again.
Yeah, and girls now are diving into this. And this pornography is brutal pornography. It's violent pornography. It's very destructive. And if we look again and go back and look at adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and realize what it says in that is that these situations that kids encounter alters their brain at the level of where their identity is being formed.
Say that again. The
ACEs, adverse childhood experience, trauma, and pornography is trauma.
Yeah.
Let's be honest about it. It alters the brain, trauma alters the brain at the level of where their identities are being formed.
Okay.
I didn't say that. That's in the script.
Yeah.
If we understand that, then we know it's not about gender dysphoria. We know that it's not oftentimes about sexuality or anything else. It's about something that's interrupted the natural process that the Lord Jesus Christ gave us in our development, because we as adults have totally given way to this absolute sinful, barbaric Frankenstein nonsense of calling kids transgender, transitioning, and gender dysphoria. It's all a total lie. The biggest fraud in medical history, right there.
Wow. Well, it's terrifying to talk about all of this, but oddly, after talking with you, Walt, I feel a sense of hope. And I think parents who are listening to this, grandparents, others who really care about what kids are going through, now have a sense of how they can approach it. Rather than be afraid, they can be bold. Rather than being, feeling like they can medicalize this, they can actually then dig into the underlying issues in the psychology to help children really heal in their minds. It's hard to imagine that we have actually gotten to the place where we believe, and the standards of care instruct doctors to mutilate the body as a way of healing the mind.
We should all be weeping.
Yeah.
We should all be weeping.
Yeah.
This is horrible.
Well, I appreciate your insights on trauma. That's a huge breakthrough in my own thinking about how we process this with young adults. And I thank you for sharing your story, Walt. You're very bold, and your courage has helped a lot of people today, and I know it has throughout your ministry, the articles that you've written, the books, the speeches, and so forth. I just want to say thank you.
No, my pleasure. If I can just help one person, I'm thrilled, blessed.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me on so I can have this conversation with you, and hopefully we can help a lot of people.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you to my guest today, Walt Heyer, for coming on the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. So you want to find out more about Walt and his work, and here's how to do that. Walt Heyer. His last name is spelled Heyer. So Walt, Heyer.com, waltheyer.com. And also, you can take a look at the website sexchangeregret.com for more resources. So Jesus said in John 8:32, if you follow my teaching, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Can you imagine everything that this rising generation needs to be set free from? But can you imagine everything that could happen in this generation if they would be set free to something, which is to bear God's image in a way that brings glory to Him? That's the hope that we have in everything we do on this show and at Summit Ministries. Thanks for joining this week. Listeners, I want you to know that our podcast is on Edify, which is a truly powerful app that brings together thousands of the best Christian podcasts in one place for your listening enjoyment. You can download it at Edify, EDIFI.app. Be sure to share this show if you have enjoyed listening to it, and leave a review if you would on the site where you download the show. That helps more people know about the Dr. Jeff Show, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week.